Okay, so I'm Ludovic Margerin. I'm coming from Toulouse. I'm working in an astrophysics and planetology lab. And I'm going to illustrate some ideas about seismic scattering, using first some numerical experiments and then some application to real data. And in particular, I will continue to present you some results that we have obtained in the framework of the InSight mission to Mars, following the talk of Eleanor. So, of course, nothing would have been possible without the contribution of many, many people. So I would like to thank all the PhD students who have been involved in this work. So Sabrina Menina, Nicolas Comper, Malcolm Celorio, Andrés Barraras, and also some more recent people, master students. And my collaborators, so in Toulouse, Raphaël Garcia, Marie Calvé, in Grenoble, Michel, Emmanuel Chaljub, and in Paris, for InSight, Taishi Kawamura and Philippe Lognonet. And I want to thank Christophe for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And of course, the organizers who worked hard for us. So thank you. Okay, so for me, what attracted me to this planetary seismology is the variety of propagation regime that we have when we compare different planets. So, as you know, on Earth, it's the realm of ray theory and ballistic wave propagation. We have these beautiful PNS arrivals. We pick them, and we make tomography and 3D images of the Earth with that. And this contrasts very much with what we have on the Moon. So on the Moon, we have almost no ballistic waves. You see these very characteristic signals, with very slowly emergent seismic waves, very long duration. So typical quake on the Moon lasts for more than an hour. And more recently, we also have data from Mars. And I'm going to show you that it's yet another story, something a bit intermediate between the Moon and the Earth. And in fact, what the origin of the very large difference between these data is one physical mechanism, which is basically my field of expertise, is the seismic attenuation. And as you know, there are two mechanisms that enter into attenuation. So one is scattering, and scattering is due to the presence of a lot of small-scale heterogeneities, which are quite apparent when you look at a piece of rock or if you just look at the topography around. But they are not so much visible on seismic tomographies. So here, of course, it's a cartoon, but typically a tomography model always looks smooth at a certain scale. But it's not the reality. In reality, if you look at natural samples, so if you take a piece of this low velocity part of the medium here and you zoom in, you will find that there are small-scale fluctuations. So here you can imagine that the colors represent fluctuation in velocity or density, okay? And we have many scales that are represented with fluctuations. So here, it's a typical case of continuous variation of some elastic parameters. But when you go near the surface, it can be much more complicated with faults and pores and cracks and all kinds of things. Okay, so this is for the scattering part. And now, of course, we have a very important additional mechanism, which is dissipation. Call it absorption also. And dissipation, we think, occurs at much smaller scales. I mean, really at the pore scale, at the grain boundary scale. Okay, and what is very important for planetology is that the level of absorption is thought to be representative of the water content. And just to give you tell you a short story about that, when the first samples, rock samples, were brought back from the Moon and were analyzed in the lab, the conclusion was that the Q of this, so these were basalts, were actually the same or even lower than what was found on Earth, which was totally at odds with what people were expecting, because we had these super long signals with duration of an hour, so it didn't add up. And it's a guy, this guy is not so well known besides the planetology community. His name is Titman, and Titman performed a lot of experiments in the laboratory with rock sample, and he understood that the reason why people had measured so low Q values for the lunar basalts was just because of contamination of the sample by the moisture that was contained in the air. So just a layer of water, so a molecule of water, actually it's not water, it's dissociated, but okay, let's call it water, was enough to drop the quality factor by 1 order of magnitude, okay? And so what he did, he took samples of basaltic rocks on Earth, put them in vacuum, heated them very strongly, so to crack the rock and degas it, and he did that many, many times. And what he found is that although you totally break the material, you introduce cracks and lots of defects, you increase the Q. The Q increases, and you can basically, in the laboratory, take a piece of Earth basalt and make it have the Q as large as you want and bring it to the value that we now think is the typical value of the moon, which is something as high as 5,000 or something like that, okay? It's not super precise, but typically 10 times higher Q on the moon than on Earth. And of course, the super interesting thing for planetologists is the fact that this value of the Q is a marker of the content of water. Water, to be understood as, okay, even some layer of H+, of protons, is what we mean by water. But this has been very influential, and so this is one of the motivations why we want to separate the two sources of attenuation, to be able to measure the absorption and make a diagnostic of the content of water. But scattering is also interesting for planetology. For example, we know that at the surface of the moon and of Mars, we have a regolith. And actually, this regolith is quite tricky to interpret other geophysical data, for example, gravity data. And this has been very well demonstrated in the case of the moon. In the case of the moon, in fact, there has been a reinterpretation of gravity data based on the understanding that, in fact, the regolith was very extended up to 50 kilometers. Okay? So having an idea of the depth extent of the scattering and connecting this to the porosity of the medium is also quite important for other geophysical applications. Okay? And so this is what we try to do in the framework of InSight. So now I'm going to present you some classical stuff about scattering and heterogeneity. So usually the way we represent heterogeneity, and the most important quantity that we are going to use, so one of them is the correlation function. So basically what you do, you just look at the resemblance between the variation of some parameter, so here I take the velocity, okay, between any 2 points in the medium. And so this defines what we call the correlation function. And as you can see here, I'm making a strong assumption here that this correlation function does not depend on the absolute position of the 2 points, but just on the difference of position. So you see that x has disappeared here. So in general, we assume that the medium is translational invariant. It's a common assumption. It's not super important, but okay. It's the way I'm going to present the things here. And so these are typical fluctuations that you observe in the case of well logging data in a borehole. So we go up to a depth of 1,700 meters here, so 1 kilometer of material. So you can see that there are discontinuities associated to different lithologies, but inside each layer, you see that you have small-scale fluctuations. Okay, so this is the important thing, and these small-scale fluctuations is what is going to produce the scattering. And here, So one other important piece of information is that the fluctuation of the different parameters, elastic parameters, so the density and the seismic velocities, do not vary independently. So here on this axis, you have the measured P-wave velocity, and here you have the measured density, and you see that they are strongly correlated. Here this is for the shear wave velocity and the density, and here the two velocities. So in general, when you increase the density, you increase the velocity. Okay, not so surprising. And we summarize this with this law, which we call Birch law, after the name of Birch, which contributed a lot to the understanding of this correlation. And it's not essential, but it reduces a lot the computational burden when you do scattering theory. So it's good to know. Okay, another way of displaying the same thing, which is interesting, is instead of looking at the correlation, you look at its Fourier transform. And we call this the power spectrum. I think you are familiar with that. And so this is a compilation that has been made by Sato. So he used different type of observations, so rocks, the type of borehole data that's shown on the left here. So here you have the wave number on this scale. So so it's in inverse kilometer from 1 to 10 to the power 8. It's 8 orders of magnitude here. And here you have about 20 orders of magnitude. So quite impressive. But what is important is that what you observed at different scales, so here the scale of the rock, here the scale of the well log, is this power law behavior. The fact that you have small scales present, okay, at any wave number, okay. So you have this distribution of fluctuation over orders of magnitude, okay. And as you can see here, you see that this power law plateaus at some point in the wave number domain, and so this reflects what we call the correlation length of the medium. So actually, this correlation length is, of course, strongly connected to the size of the sample you are using. If you take a piece of rock of 10 centimeters, you do not expect to find a correlation length of 1 meter, of course. So this cutoff here, this transition between the plateau and the power law behavior, which defines the correlation length, is very strongly dependent on the sample size. And I think someone like Chris Bean could tell you more about the effect of sampling and the role of the bandwidth of data in the definition or the apparent correlation length, okay? But the general idea that these fluctuations of velocity can be described by power law behavior is very useful, and we even have a general formula for that, which is here. So here you have the correlation length, okay? It is what it is. Here we have the wave number of the fluctuation, and the power law is here, okay? So we have a plateau here up to a scale length, a wave number, which is the inverse of this correlation distance, and then a power law decay with an exponent which describes the rate at which you basically cut off the high wave numbers in your fluctuation, and this is what we call the Hurst exponent. So this is a very general law that we use repeatedly in scattering theory. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the role of this Hurst exponent, so this is taken from the book of Sato, Weidenfeller, and I strongly recommend it to you as a very good general reference about scattering and heterogeneity. It's an excellent textbook. And so we see here different type of media, so Gaussian media, and here this von Karman media. So these are basically this media with a power law behavior. And you see the Hurst exponent basically controls what I would say the rugosity of the medium. So if you have a large Hurst exponent, that means you have a strong cutoff of the small scales. And so the medium looks smooth, whereas if the Hurst exponent is close to 0, then you have a lot of small scales in the medium, and then it starts to look much more irregular. And what's interesting is that all these media have exactly the same correlation length. Okay, So really, the importance of the Yerst exponent is in controlling the texture of the random medium. Okay, so now we are going to look at what happens when we send a wave into this type of disordered media, which are thought to be representative of the fluctuation that we encounter in nature. Okay, so the simulation I'm going to show you, it's very simplified. It's a 2D simulation, SH wave, with the correlative fluctuations of density and velocity. Okay, and in that case, we took an exponential correlation, which is a specific class of this media with a power law behavior. Okay, on the sides, we have periodic boundary condition. Top and bottom, we have absorbing boundary condition, and this has been solved with SpecFEM 2D. Okay, so the plane waves enter at the bottom here, and then it's a mess. You mean the magnitude? Yeah. We did different type of, I don't know in this particular example, but I'm going to show you, well, we tested 5%, 10%, maybe more, I don't remember. That's the typical order of magnitude. Okay, so what we see basically, we saw the plane wave coming in, okay? We saw some diffraction. There was a particularly strong diffraction point here. I don't know if you have seen here, but it produces its own spherical wave that, because of the boundary condition, exits from here and comes back from here. Here behind the wavefront, we see a lot of these diffraction patterns, and way behind the wavefront, it's a bit messy. So basically, the color scale is just to tell you where it's blue, I guess it's positive, the displacement is positive, where it's red, it's negative, okay? So it's quite complicated. Nevertheless, well, we will be able to say quite a few things about what's going on. So the first thing that you noticed is that there is a part of the wave field that basically propagates in the same direction as the incoming plane wave, okay? There is a... So we have the wave that arise from below, and this part of the wave field, which keeps exactly the propagation direction of the incident wave, we give it a specific name. We call it the coherent field. Okay, and any wave that at some point of its life has changed direction from the initial direction of the plane wave, the incoming plane wave, it's called incoherent, okay? And because of its incoherence, when you average the wave field over many realizations, you will basically destroy this incoherent wave and extract the coherent wave, okay? So this is what I'm going to illustrate now. So these are a typical example of waveforms. Okay, so here you have the ballistic arrival. You see a lot of scattering coming in after that. You see also that there are interactions between the scattered wave and the incident wave. And here you have clearly a reduction of the amplitude of the ballistic wave. So it fluctuates quite a lot. And after you do the ensemble average, this is what you get. So basically, what happens is that you entirely remove, or almost entirely remove, the scattered part, and you are left with the coherent wave, okay, which is also called the mean field, and because you obtain this coherent wave by taking the ensemble average. Yes?
By realization, you mean changing the velocity model?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for asking. Indeed, yeah. So what we did to extract this coherent wave, we basically generate random media, okay, and we do an average over many realizations. I think here it's something like 180, something like that. So quite a lot, huh? And each simulation I think is about 30 minutes, okay? So it takes quite some numerical effort. And as you can see, so here it's the broadband mean field. So what is apparent is the fact that you see that the high frequency seem to disappear more rapidly. You see that when you have propagated a certain distance, the signal is lower frequency than the initial one. Okay, and very important, you see that the amplitude of this wave is decreasing, and the central result that you have to keep in mind, okay, most important, is that the mean field decays exponentially. It looks like something trivial. Actually, if you want to prove it, it takes quite some work, okay? And this exponential decay introduces a very important scale length that I'm using all the time when I talk about scattering, is the scattering mean free path, okay? So the scattering mean free path is just the typical attenuation length of the coherent wave, okay? So now, let's have a look at how the scattering mean free path varies as a function of frequency. So I'm going to introduce some different frequency regime. So again, here it's based on both the numerical simulation. So these are the dashed lines. So we took different value for the parameter nu, which correlates the velocity and the density. And here it's a theory. So here we took the easiest, simplest theory. It's the second order Born approximation. It's the one that all seismologists are using. And we compare it with the numerical simulation. And actually, it's not too bad. It's not perfect, but the agreement is quite good. For some reason, it's not as good at low frequency. I don't know if it's a problem with the numerical simulation or the theory. But in any case, both qualitatively and quantitatively, I think it's really satisfactory. And we can say a bit more about what happens as a function of frequency. So we can identify two regimes of propagation. So one is what we call the long wavelength or low frequency regime. That is when the incident wavelength, okay, is large compared to the correlation distance. So in that case, so the scattering attenuation, so which is just the inverse of the scattering mean free path, okay, but I think it's more intuitive to think in terms of attenuation. So it's expressed in inverse kilometers, okay? So in this long wavelength or low frequency regime, we have the classical Rayleigh law, which tells us that the attenuation increases like the third power of the frequency. So here it's a 3 because we are in 2 dimensions, okay? If we were doing the same experiment in 3 dimensions, it would be the 4th power. Okay. And then we have a regime which actually no one talks about it. I don't know in the seismological community, but for the people who do non-destructive testing, we find it classically. It's called the stochastic regime. There is nothing stochastic, in fact. It's totally deterministic in terms of explaining it, but it has been coined. This term has been coined by some guy, and then it has survived. So I will call it stochastic. And so we see in this stochastic regime, we have a transition from the F-cube behavior to the F-squared behavior, and this transition occurs at a frequency which here corresponds to the moment where the wavelength starts to be of the order of the correlation distance. Okay, so as we increase the frequency, we reduce the wavelength, and then when the wavelength starts to be of the order of the correlation distance in the medium, we have this transition to the stochastic regime with characteristic F-squared behavior, and this behavior is the same in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So actually, if we were in 3 dimensions, we would see much more clearly the transition between the Rayleigh and stochastic, because we will have the first power, the transition from first power to second power. Here it's only third power to second power, but okay. And these transitions, in fact, are associated with changes in the way the scattering occurs. So when you are in the long wavelength regime, what you are basically sensing are in fact, the nature of the elastic fluctuations. And in our case, in the case of geophysical media, the most important fluctuations are the ones caused by impedance variation. So basically, impedance is defined here as just the product of density and velocity. Okay? And historically, there has been a distinction which is quite interesting, which has been made between pure impedance fluctuation, so fluctuation of the product of velocity and density, but keeping the density constant, okay, and pure velocity fluctuation, that is, you just vary the velocity and you keep this guy constant, okay. And in the case of the Earth, and probably other planets, these are the dominant contribution at low frequency. And so when you look at the scattering pattern, so here we have a wave coming from this direction and scattered in this direction, and so it's coming from here, okay, and we look at the way it is scattered in all directions. You have this massive lobe of backscattering, which is caused by this impedance fluctuation. Okay, so this is a polar diagram representing this guy here, P of K of R, which is the scattering pattern. Okay, so we have K the incoming direction, R the outgoing direction, and we look at the distribution of energy as a function of the outgoing direction R, and so we have this massive lobe of backscattering. And when you transition to the higher frequencies, we enter into the stochastic regime, and then it is the power spectrum of the fluctuation that comes in, and that, in fact, introduces a strong cutoff in the scattering angle. You see it here. Huh? Now you are not allowed to scatter in the forward direction anymore, and this is the effect of the power spectrum here. And so you have this very strong lobe of scattering in the forward direction. Okay? And this occurs basically when the wavelength is of the order of the correlation distance, because then you basically, when you do a scattering experiment, in fact, you are probing this power spectrum for different values of the wave number. Okay? And as you increase the wave number, you start to see the power law behavior, and the effect is to cut off, the physical effect that you see in a scattering experiment is to cut off the large angles of scattering. And this is what explains this very strong lobe of scattering in the forward direction. This is the transition from the plateau of the correlation, of the power spectrum to the power law decay. Okay, so now, all is well. We have a perfect theory for the mean field. Is it useful? The answer is, for us, not really. What I mean by that, of course, it's very useful, but there is no way we seismologists, extract the mean field in the way I did it in the numerical experiment. The reason is that we have only one realization, and to extract the mean field, it's really critical to do the true ensemble average. Okay? There have been attempts at playing with the data, doing travel time correction, etc. But in my opinion, they have not been successful. And so we have to admit in seismology that we are always going to work with both the coherent field, so the one that propagates unscattered, and all the scattered wave, which we call also incoherent. Okay? So in spite of all these nice results, we cannot experimentally extract the mean field to measure the scattering attenuation. We have to do it differently. And the different way is by introducing these transport models. So instead of looking at the mean field, we are going to look at the mean intensity. Okay? And so this is an example of the mean intensity. So every gray line represents a single realization of the intensity for a particular random medium. Okay? And then we average the intensity, and we get this super smooth curve here in black. And this is what we can measure easily, more or less easily, in seismology. And from this intensity, we can try to extract the scattering attenuation. So to do that, so we have this transport equation. Okay? So in the transport equation, we have an intensity. So it's here, okay? It's I. So it depends on the position, depends on the time, but it also depends on an additional quantity, which is the propagation direction, okay? So instead of having just an intensity, we have, yes?
So just to be sure, this intensity is not the energy and it's not the envelope.
Yes, it is.
It is the envelope.
It's the well, I mean, I put U squared, but okay, you can do the Hilbert transform, do the stuff, but fundamentally, it's important that it's an energetic concept. Okay, so the specific intensity, it's called specific because it is angularly resolved. Okay, that is, you are able to tell, thanks to this theory, how much energy flows in a particular direction. Okay, and so here it's a classical representation. We have a surface, we have the normal, and we are able to say how much energy flows in any direction thanks to the knowledge of this specific intensity. So it's an angularly resolved energy flux. Okay? And so here in this transport equation, there are different ways of understanding it. So one is to say, okay, we write down the balance of energy. So we follow a beam of ray in a given propagation direction. We have losses due to scattering and absorption. And here I write it in the seismological way. That is, I'm using the classical quality factor, scattering Q and intrinsic Q. But they are related, in fact, to our mean free path here that I have introduced previously. So the mean free path of the mean field, to be clear. And an absorption length, okay, which here is introduced completely phenomenologically. But this is the way we proceed in transport theory. Okay, so we can either say, okay, we have a local energy balance. We follow a beam of energy in a given direction k. It is attenuated by scattering and absorption. It is this term here. Okay, but it can also gain energy thanks to the scattering of a beam that propagates in the other direction k prime, okay, and is being scattered in the specific direction k. Okay? And here we find the function p of kk prime that I introduced previously, which describes the anisotropy of the scattering. So this guy is very strongly dependent of the typical frequency of your signal. Okay? There is another way of interpreting this equation. Is using a how to say that? Yeah, it's more in the viewing it as a multiple scattering series. So what I mean by that is that forget this term for the moment. Okay. So just look at this term here and the source term. So here is where you inject the energy. Okay. And this guy here, what is just describing, you recognize, if you are familiar, you recognize the one-way wave equation here, with an additional term here, which represents the losses. So in fact, this is just describing the coherent propagation. So here you inject the energy, you start from the source, okay, and then you propagate it coherently, okay. So that is, your waves are being, so if this is a point source, for example, you're just going to see an expanding spherical wave that attenuates exponentially. And then this wave arrives at the first scattering point, and then the energy is redistributed following the angular pattern of scattering. Okay. This diffuse energy now propagates coherently again, okay, up to the second scattering point, where it undergoes again some changes of propagation direction due to the scattering, etc., etc. And in this way, you can build up a complete multiple scattering series, okay? And what is really nice is that it treats exactly on the same footing the coherent and incoherent intensity. Both are included, okay? The part that is unscattered, okay, in the medium, is just your coherent intensity, okay? And any part of the intensity which will be scattered at least once will be your incoherent intensity, okay? And we have basically the two that are described in this same equation. And so we can directly compare this to the data. So just very quickly, show you that this theory works not too bad. These are a comparison between numerical experiment and this radiative transfer model. And you can see that it reproduces extremely well a number of propagation regimes. So here we have very strong ballistic waves, so rather weak scattering. Here we start to see, here we have strong ballistic wave, and then we start to enter into a regime which we call the diffusion regime, okay? Because this equation, I'm not going to enter into detail, but this equation, after many scattering events, okay, you can show that the specific intensity obeys not this, well, it still obeys this transport equation, but it also obeys a simplified model, which is called the diffusion model, okay? So the diffusion model basically operates when the dependence of the specific intensity on the propagation direction becomes weak, okay? So that is when the specific intensity is more or less isotropic, okay? Which is also related to what we call equipartitioning, as was discussed yesterday by Roel, okay? So when this guy is totally independent of K prime, you have perfect equipartition. Of course, it is never the case because we always have energy transport, so we always have a little bit of anisotropy in the medium. Otherwise, we would have no transport, okay? And so, yeah, so here we enter this diffusion regime, and you see that there is a rather good match between this model and the numerical simulation. Just to put things in perspective, to solve this equation, it takes 100 lines of code, and you to return, okay? If you want to produce these curves, you need to do many simulations. So, yeah. By Monte Carlo simulation, this is what we do. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, just very briefly, how does this allow us to separate scattering and absorption? I'm going to just give you the idea, okay? So these are solutions of the transport equation, okay? And what we can show is that we have a completely different scaling for the coherent and incoherent intensity. And this is the different scaling which allows us to do the separation. So typically, if you look at the ballistic peak here, what you can show is that it decays exponentially. And here you find that the exponential decay is controlled by both the scattering mean free path and the absorption length. So this guy decays exponentially, and the spatial rate of exponential decay is the sum of the scattering and absorption contribution, okay? Here, D is the space dimension, so we don't care, we are in 3D or 2D. And then, if we go to long lapse time, sufficiently long, okay? I'm not going to say specifically, but say, well, ideally, we would like to be in the diffusive regime, okay? Then, in this regime, what you can show is that the long time decay is exponential, and here you just have a term which we call T sub A, which is just the absorption time, so it's just this guy divided by the wave velocity. So the absorption length divided by the velocity is the absorption time, okay? And so now you understand how things work. From the decay of this guy, you get the sum of scattering and absorption, and from the decay at long time, you get the absorption, and so you can do the separation. And this idea has been basically standardized in a method which is called the multiple lifetime window analysis. It's been done by more than 20 years ago by Sato, Feller, Oshiba. The papers are very readable. The method, I think you can download some software and apply it to your data. There is, I should say, one very important assumption behind the method is that there is no strong stratification of the scattering properties. Okay, so that supposes that you have a half space with uniform scattering properties. If this is not the case, and I will show you that not always the case in planets, you have to work a bit harder. Okay, I'm not going to enter into details. And I would like to show you now some application to InSight. Okay, so I will be brief because Eleanor has already done the job. So as you know, we have this beautiful seismometer that has been deployed at the surface of Mars. and which has recorded a lot of events. So there are two families of events. So basically, the classification has been made based on the spectral content. So we have basically the broadband and the low frequency family, which are the least numerous. They are very interesting because they contain the few ballistic waves that we have detected. So they can be located, and they allow us to start to do some 1D model of the structure of Mars. But the vast majority of events are high frequency. So they are high frequency, and as I'm going to show you, the waveforms are quite complex. And we also classify them with the quality. So most of the events I'm going to show you are quality B because they basically cannot be, we can give an estimate of the distance, but not of the azimuth because the signal is too random, is too diffuse. Okay. And in addition to this high frequency events, we have what we call super high frequency events. Okay. And in fact, just to go very quickly on this, these are totally similar to the thermal moonquakes. That is, they are triggered when the sun sets on InSight. Okay, so this is this line here. Okay, so it's like yesterday on the same representation. It's a one day on Mars, and we call it a sol. Okay, you have sunrise here, sunset here, and when sun sets, so as you know, the noise decreases very strongly, and then we can start to listen to Mars, and Mars is cracking every night, and we can record a lot of very, very tiny events. If you look at the amplitude, it's 10 to the minus 9 meters per second, so nanometer per second. But these are interesting waveforms, and we can exploit them. Okay, so here is an example of a very high frequency event. As you can see, it's very similar to the one Eleanor showed yesterday, with the difference of the amplitude, because I think if you see here, the amplitude is 10 to the minus 10, so it's super small. They are 2 angstroms in terms of displacement, so really tiny event. But the waveform is quite similar to the big one that Eleanor showed yesterday. And I'm just going to tell you briefly, just with one of these events, how we can start to say something about the attenuation in Mars. So basically, we have just one event, okay? We have one waveform, and nevertheless, we are able to say something about the attenuation properties. And so the way we do that, we use our transport model. So this time, it's a bit more sophisticated than what I showed. It's a transport model which includes the coupling between P and S wave. So it starts to make a big set of equations, coupled equation between the P and S intensities. In addition to that, we can add the polarization information, but here we have not done it. But the idea is the same. We are going to exploit, to do the separation, the ratio between the coherent and incoherent intensities. Okay, and we do that, in fact, in an automated way. So we have an initial model. Okay, so we have the data first. Okay, the data. This is this envelope. Okay, shown by this the wiggly lines here. Okay, we have an initial model. Okay, it is what it is. We see that it's quite far away from the data. We have our transport model, and what we do, we compute just the partial derivative of the envelope with respect to the parameters that describe the strength of the scattering and the strength of the absorption. And so why we can do the separation is because, in fact, as you can see, these two partial derivatives are not linearly dependent. Okay, so this would be the case where we cannot do the separation. But here we can see that these two curves are quite different. So you might wonder why, when I increase the absorption, I increase the energy. Doesn't look normal. It's just because when we want to make the comparison between model and data, we have to cross-normalize the two. So what we do here, we take a window here where we compute the energy and we normalize the energy of both the data and the theoretical part by an energy integral. Okay, and so here you see that the sensitivity, all the sensitivities go to 0, okay? And this is due to the normalization procedure only, okay? So of course, if I increase the amount of absorption, I'm going to relatively decrease much more the level of energy at long time than at short time. And so this explains why you have this curve which is positive. By contrast, if I increase the scattering, I'm going to transfer from energy from the ballistic wave to the coda wave, okay? And so I'm going to relatively decrease the amount of energy that I have in my signal. And what is quite interesting, and I would like to draw your attention on that, is that the sensitivity to the scattering, which is the black line here, is really concentrated near the ballistic arrivals, okay? So the message is that if you want to have an information about the scattering, don't go in the coda. Don't go in the coda. It's too late. You have to, if you want to know the scattering, you have to really work near the ballistic waves. Okay? Otherwise, the sensitivity goes very rapidly to 0. And I insist, here I have blown up the scattering sensitivity by a factor of 5 so that you could see it. But in fact, the largely dominant effect is the effect of absorption. Okay? So basically, all the information we get on the scattering is near the ballistic waves. So if you throw them away, you lose the information on the scattering properties. Okay, so we do that. We do first iteration, and then little by little, we converge to this final model. Okay, and you see, so the final model is here, and this model fits the data, and we can do that for several events. And in the end, we get this. So here, as I told you, we have we know that the behavior of the intensity at long lifetime is diffusive. So because of the importance of the lunar data in planetology, we convert all the scattering measurement into an equivalent diffusivity. Okay, so it's a practice in planetology. So here, I represent the equivalent diffusivity. Of course, here it's not totally diffusive, but we can still compute the equivalent diffusivity, and this is what is represented here, as a function of the distance between the event and the station. So because we do not have absolute distance, here I'm just showing the difference of travel time between the S and the P waves. Okay? But the nearest events are a few hundred kilometers away, something like 300-400 kilometers, and the most distant one are probably 2,000 kilometers away, something like that. Okay? So here you have the diffusivity, and here you have the absorption. So how does that compare to what we know? In fact, here you have the value of the Q. The frequency here is a few hertz, or around 5 hertz, and you see the Q is extremely large. Okay? So 4,000, and what we see, the trend that we see in all our measurements, okay, is that there is an apparent increase of the quality factor and the diffusivity with the distance. So extremely large Q, and the diffusivity is something not so, it's not so small, in fact. The medium is not super diffusive. It's more typical of what we could have in a craton, for example, on Earth. It's not crazily heterogeneous, but this has a lot to do with the fact that in the model that I'm showing, I assume that it's a uniformly scattering half space. Okay? But the observation that the diffusivity, apparent diffusivity, increases with the lapse time is certainly an indication that there is a strong stratification of the heterogeneity on Mars, and this is actually what the type of model we are developing. So now, in terms of planetology, so that the good news is that this stratification indicates that probably we will be able to say something about the thickness of the megaregolith, and this is our current effort. And in terms of interpreting the dissipation value, the fact that it's super high suggests at least at sufficiently large scale, there is absolutely no evidence of free water in the crust of Mars. Okay? Which was in fact expected. It is known that there is ice trapped in the subsurface of Mars. And so it was expected that there could be some free water in the crust of Mars, but our data suggests that it's absolutely not the case. So I have 10 minutes. Can I show you some temporal variation? Yes? Okay. So I will very briefly, so because Roel already mentioned that yesterday, just want to remind you, so I'm not going to comment, you know this very well, you do cross-correlation. So these are the Apollo data. It's the work of Christophe and Eric Larose. So they did basically CODA wave interferometry, passive image interferometry, in fact, because they were using ambient noise. And they found this very interesting behavior. So here is the temperature at the surface of the moon, the red curve, okay? And here are the relative delay time that they measured in the CODA of the ambient noise cross-correlation. And what they saw that basically when you increase the temperature at the surface of the moon, you decrease the velocity with a certain delay, okay? And just to, so this is something important. Huh? We have about 14 days of delay between the heating of the surface of Mars and the decrease of the apparent velocity. And this is due, this has been, here it's another paper, it's a work by Tanimoto. So what Tanimoto did, he basically used cross-correlation, but didn't analyze the CODA. He measured very, very accurately the group velocity and found basically, was able, it's a super, you have to be super accurate, but he was able to monitor also the velocity variation based on the measurement of the group velocity of the Rayleigh wave. And so this figure is just to explain why there is a delay between the surface temperature forcing and the velocity change that we detect. Is because the temperature, you know that the diffusion equation, if you put a periodic source, gives rise to Helmholtz equation. So it's a wave equation, okay, Helmholtz equation, with a very strong attenuation. Basically, you have the real and imaginary part of the wave number are equal, okay? So you have a propagating phenomenon, but which is very strongly attenuated. And of course, the penetration depth of the heat wave depends on the diffusivity property of the material, not of the waves, okay? To be clear. So here it's just a diffusive transport of heat in the regolith of the moon. And of course, the precise depth and the precise speed at which the heat is being transported depends on the diffusivity. And now what you see with the Rayleigh wave is basically, so this generates a change of the velocity, okay? But what you see, in fact, is the way it is sampled by the Rayleigh wave. And so this is an example of sensitivity kernel here for the shear velocity of the Rayleigh wave. And as you can see, it has the group velocity has a large sensitivity below the surface, which means that you are going to see not the surface temperature at a given time, but the temperature which was at the surface in the past, okay? Because of the sensitivity at depth, at this depth, you see the temperature that was at the surface 1, 2, 3, 10 days ago, depending on the efficacy of the diffusivity. But so this combination of sensitivity and transport of heat is what explains the delay that you see between the surface temperature and the response, and so the measured delay times. Okay, we did something similar on Mars. So we tried to monitor the velocity variations, and for that we used two type of data. So first type of data are the seismic events, so the super high frequency events, because we have many of them. Okay, so here we have about 350 sols of the mission, and so during the different time of the mission, we have different clusters of these events. And here you have an example of waveform. So this is the cluster C0. So C is because the quality C event, okay, and 0 because it was the first one we detected, so it's number 0. And so you have the waveform as a function. So the index here is just the number of the sol, okay. And you see, if you look carefully, you will remark that the first arrivals are perfectly aligned, but when you go in the CODA, you see that there is progressively a delay that occurs as the sol index increases. Okay, so we have an apparent stretching of the waveform, and from that we can extract some apparent velocity variation, and we can use all these events to to build the evolution of the velocity in the subsurface of Mars as a function of time. Just want to show you this. We can work with the waveform, but we can also work with the PSD of the data. So these are the same data, okay? Just here we show instead of showing the waveform, we show the PSDs. And here again we have the event index. The PSDs are also shown here. And I think you can clearly see that you can see some bands here, and these bands are tilted. So what we see here is just the effect of compressing or stretching a signal in the time domain. It gives you, if you stretch a signal in the time domain, you compress it in the frequency domain. Okay, so it gives rise to this particular feature here. We call them bands, okay, frequency bands, and we see that they are tilted. Okay, and the tilt here is related, of course, to the stretching of the waveform, so to the apparent velocity variation. So why I'm showing here, you will understand very shortly. So these are the measurements that we obtained with all the families of super high frequency events, but they do not allow us to cover the full Martian year. And so we decided to have a look at the ambient noise on Mars, high frequency ambient noise. So something that Eleanor has not shown. And in fact, so this ambient noise is very largely dominated by these peaks here. And these peaks are in fact the Lander modes. So there are a bunch of Lander resonances that are excited by the wind. And by far, they inject the largest amount of energy on the seismometer in the high frequency band. Nevertheless, in between the Lander modes, you see that you have some oscillation of the PSD. And they are shown here. So here, I'm making a zoom. So here you have the PSDs. I'm going to zoom in this area here. Okay, so you have a bunch of Lander resonances. Here you have a Lander resonance. Okay. But here you see this oscillation of the PSDs. And you see that so the color just tells you when it's larger or smaller than the average PSD. Okay, and we see this band structure. We see this band which deform as a function of the time in the mission. Okay, so here it's the Sol 200. Here it's Sol 800. And you see that these bands they have this very particular shape. Okay, and we interpreted the change of frequency as an apparent change of velocity in the same way we did for the events. And when we do that, we obtain this type of measurements. So this is what we obtained from the ambient noise at two different frequencies, so 5 Hertz and 7 Hertz. And this is what we obtained with the seismic event. So on this axis, you have the time in the mission, and on the vertical axis, you have the relative travel time change. And I draw your attention on the fact that on Mars, the changes we have are the order of 1%, whereas on the Moon, it's order of, 10 to the minus 0.1%. It's 10 times less probably on the Moon. And we can compare this to the surface temperature. And this is what is shown here. So we have a different so we have the data, the seismic data in blue, black, and red. And on top of that, I have added the temperature. So one coming from a model, so basically using information about the insolation at the location of InSight. One is the green one is the scientific temperature, which is measured inside the VBB sphere. And the yellow one is measured by the radiometer. And there is a radiometer that measures the ground temperature. And I think you can very easily recognize the pattern that we see in the temperature. We see it now in the velocity variation. But what is interesting is that on Mars, when the temperature increases, the velocity increases. Okay? Opposite to what we see on the Moon. Okay, so here we have a low in temperature, we have a low in velocity. Here we have an increase of temperature, we have an increase in velocity. So we have a positive correlation between the temperature variation and the velocity with a delay of about 100 days. So what is the explanation? The explanation is at least the one we propose, and this is also something that was proposed by Christophe in a different context in Chile. We think that what we see are thermoelastic stresses. So I don't have much time, but just to give you just the mechanism, and I will stop here. So what happens, what we think happens, so the idea comes from a work of Berger. So Berger was trying to explain the tilt and strain at the surface of the Earth caused by temperature variation. So he imagined a heat wave, okay? So basically you have a modulation of the temperature in both space and time. So you have a periodic forcing of the temperature plus a spatial modulation. And so what happens here is that at this point, the temperature is higher than at these 2 points. So this guy wants to dilate, okay? But these guys, they don't want to dilate. So what's going to happen is then you are going to build up a stress here due to the increase of temperature. And reciprocally here, this guy wants to contract, this guy doesn't want to contract, and so you're going to create some tensile stress here at this point. And so with this mechanism, you can explain the positive correlation between temperature and velocity. And I will stop here. If you want to know more, I have a few more slides. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this very nice talk.